November 8th, 1944. 2:20 in the afternoon. 6 miles above the Bavarian countryside, Lieutenant Tommy Walsh stares at an instrument that's about to change history. The altimeter in his B-17 Flying Fortress reads 18,000 feet. But something feels wrong. The air seems thinner than it should be. The horizon appears more distant, and the German landscape below looks smaller and more detailed than targets usually do at bombing altitude. Walsh is the bombardier for Memphis Belle Tour, TOW, flying in the lead formation of what will be the largest daylight bombing raid over southern Germany in 3 weeks. Behind him, spread across 12 miles of sky, 147 B-17 bombers carry enough high-explosive and incendiary bombs to level a medium-sized city. Their target is the railway junction at Rothenburg-Obertauber, a strategic transportation hub that German forces are using to move supplies and reinforcements toward the crumbling Western Front. Walsh adjusts the focus on his Norden bomb site and studies the landscape below. Something doesn't look right. The town approaching in his crosshairs appears too small, too intact, too peaceful for a strategic military target. Where he expects to see railway yards, freight terminals, and industrial infrastructure, he sees narrow medieval streets, ancient stone walls, and red-tiled roofs that belong in a fairy tale rather than on a target list. The altimeter still reads 18,000 feet. But Walsh has been flying combat missions for 8 months, and he's learned to trust his eyes as much as his instruments. The formation is flying too low. Not dangerously low, not low enough to be vulnerable to German flak guns, but low enough that bombing accuracy will be affected. Low enough that the careful calculations that determine where bombs will fall have been compromised by an instrument error that no one else has noticed. Walsh reaches for his intercom switch to alert the formation leader about the altitude discrepancy. His hand hovers over the control for perhaps 3 seconds. 3 seconds that will determine whether the medieval town of Rothenburg-Obertauber survives the war intact or disappears beneath a rain of Allied bombs. Below, 8-year-old Greta Müller sits at her grandmother's kitchen table, practicing arithmetic problems that seem pointless when the world is ending around her. Her grandmother, Anna, kneads bread dough with hands that remember when Rothenburg was a peaceful place where tourists came to admire cobblestone streets and half-timbered houses that had survived since the Middle Ages. Neither Greta nor Anna knows that 147 American bombers are approaching their town, guided by navigation equipment that has malfunctioned in a way that will transform their targeting calculations. Neither knows that Lieutenant Walsh is staring at his altimeter and making a decision that will determine whether their ancient town survives to see Christmas. Walsh presses the intercom switch. Lead bombardier to formation leader. I'm reading altitude discrepancy. We're showing 18,000, but flying characteristics suggest we're actually at 20,000 plus. Recommend altitude verification before bomb run. The formation leader, Major Robert Chen, checks his own altimeter and sees the same reading that Walsh reported, 18,000 feet. But Chen has learned to trust his bombardiers, especially experienced ones like Walsh, who have completed 26 combat missions without a significant targeting error. Formation leader to all aircraft. Altitude check. Report current altimeter readings. The responses come back within 30 seconds, each pilot reporting the same reading, 18,000 feet. But Chen notices something that the altimeter readings don't capture. The formation is flying in perfect visibility, with unlimited view of the German countryside below. At 18,000 feet over Europe in November, they should be encountering at least scattered clouds, possibly weather that would complicate visual bombing. Chen makes a command decision that will echo through history. All aircraft, maintain current altitude, but adjust bombing calculations for possible altitude discrepancy. Bombardiers use visual confirmation for targeting. 5 minutes later, the mechanical failure that had started with a single faulty altimeter reading spreads through the formation's targeting calculations like a virus. Bomb release points calculated for 18,000 feet become inaccurate when applied to an actual altitude of 21,000 feet. Wind drift calculations change. Target acquisition timing shifts. The precision bombing that was supposed to destroy Rothenburg's railway junction instead scatters explosives across empty farmland 2 miles north of the town. Greta Miller hears the sound of aircraft engines overhead and runs to the window, where she sees the silver shapes of American bombers passing over Rothenburg like a metallic cloud. She watches bombs falling toward the earth, but not toward her town. The explosives arc away from the medieval streets and ancient buildings, falling instead toward fields where nothing grows in November except stubble and mud. Anna joins her granddaughter at the window and watches bombs exploding in distant fields, sending up columns of black smoke and earth that mark where destruction was meant to fall, but didn't. She doesn't understand why the American bombers have missed their target, but she understands that something miraculous has happened. Something that has preserved their town when it should have been obliterated. "Why didn't they bomb us, Oma?" Greta asks. Anna doesn't have an answer. She doesn't know about Lieutenant Walsh's faulty altimeter, about Major Chen's decision to trust his bombardier's judgment, about the chain of small errors and individual choices that guided American bombs away from a town that contained no legitimate military targets, but appeared on Allied target lists because of its railway connections. Sometimes, Anna tells her granddaughter, angels wear the uniforms of enemies. In war, precision kills. Modern warfare had become a science of mathematics, where bombing accuracy was measured in circular error probables, where target destruction was calculated in pounds of explosive per square foot, where the difference between military necessity and civilian massacre was determined by the precision of instruments that measured altitude, wind speed, and aircraft position. But sometimes, imprecision saves. Sometimes, the instrument that fails preserves what the instrument that works would destroy. Sometimes, the error that compromises military effectiveness becomes the mistake that protects human heritage. The bombing of Rothenburg ob der Tauber was supposed to exemplify the Allied strategic bombing campaign that was systematically destroying German transportation infrastructure in late 1944. American and British bomber forces were conducting round-the-clock attacks designed to cripple German logistics, prevent the movement of military supplies, and accelerate the collapse of Nazi resistance. Rothenburg appeared on Allied target lists not because it contained aircraft factories or munitions plants, but because its medieval railway station connected north-south and east-west rail lines that German forces were using to move troops and equipment. The town's strategic value was purely logistical. Destroy the railway junction, and German supply lines would be disrupted across a significant portion of southern Germany. The irony of targeting Rothenburg lay in the contrast between its military significance and its cultural heritage. The town had survived virtually unchanged since the 30 Years' War. Its medieval walls and half-timbered houses preserved by economic stagnation that had protected it from the industrial development that had transformed most European cities. Rothenburg, in 1944, looked much as it had in 1644. A living museum of medieval German architecture that existed nowhere else in Central Europe. Allied planners were aware of Rothenburg's historical significance, but strategic bombing in 1944 followed the principle of military necessity over cultural preservation. The war had reached a stage where any target that contributed to German military capability was considered legitimate, regardless of its artistic, historical, or cultural value. Lieutenant Walsh's altimeter malfunction created an opportunity for cultural preservation that military planning had not provided. The instrument error that compromised bombing accuracy also protected a town that represented irreplaceable European heritage from destruction that would have been tactically justified but culturally devastating. Walsh never learned about the broader significance of his targeting error until decades after the war ended. His post-mission report noted the altitude discrepancy and recommended inspection of the aircraft's altimeter system, but it didn't mention that his decision to alert the formation leader had saved one of Europe's best-preserved medieval towns from obliteration. The altimeter was indeed faulty, its mechanism damaged by vibration from repeated combat missions and temperature changes from high-altitude flight. The instrument had been reading 3,000 feet low for several missions, but the error had gone unnoticed because previous targets had been large industrial complexes where precision bombing was less critical than area destruction. Walsh's crew chief, Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, discovered the altimeter malfunction during post-flight inspection and replaced the instrument before the next mission. Rodriguez logged the repair as routine maintenance, unaware that the faulty instrument had redirected American bombs away from a medieval town and into empty fields where they harmed nothing except earthworms and field mice. The bombs that missed Rothenburg fell on farmland that belonged to a farmer named Heinrich Weber, who had evacuated his family to relatives in Munich when Allied bombing of southern Germany intensified. Weber's fields absorbed 47 500-pound bombs and 16 incendiary clusters that created craters and scorched earth, but destroyed no property of value except for a wooden fence and a hay shed that had been empty since harvest. Weber returned to his farm after the war and found his fields pockmarked with bomb craters that gradually filled with rainwater and became ponds where ducks nested and fish spawned. The man who had lost his crops to American bombs discovered that he had gained a landscape of small lakes that attracted wildlife and eventually became a destination for tourists who came to Rothenburg to see the medieval town that had survived the war intact. Weber never resented the bombing of his farm. He understood that his empty fields had received explosives that were meant for the town where his sister lived, where his childhood friends had raised their families, where the church bells still rang from towers that had called people to prayer for 800 years. "I lost a hayshed," Weber would tell visitors decades later, "but I kept a town." The preservation of Rothenburg ob der Tauber became part of the larger story of cultural heritage that survived World War II through a combination of chance, choice, and error. Ancient buildings, irreplaceable artworks, and historic districts endured the most destructive war in human history because individuals made decisions that valued preservation over destruction, even when military logic demanded otherwise. Walsh's decision to alert his formation leader about the altimeter discrepancy represented one of thousands of individual choices that determined what survived and what was lost during the Allied bombing campaign. Pilots who chose alternate targets when weather obscured primary objectives. Bombardiers who aborted attack runs when civilian areas were too close to military targets. Commanders who delayed missions when intelligence suggested that cultural sites might be damaged. These individual decisions accumulated into a preservation pattern that saved more European cultural heritage than post-war planners had dared to hope. Towns like Rothenburg, historic districts in major cities, and individual buildings of architectural significance survived because people like Walsh made split-second choices that valued accuracy over efficiency, preservation over destruction. But the story of Rothenburg's preservation also illustrates the role of chance and error in determining what survives catastrophic events. Walsh's altimeter failed at exactly the right moment to redirect bombs away from the town. The formation leader trusted his bombardier's judgment rather than relying solely on instrument readings. The altitude error occurred over a target where missing by 2 miles meant hitting empty fields rather than civilian areas. Any one of these factors could have been different, and Rothenburg would have been destroyed. If Walsh's altimeter had functioned correctly, the bombing would have been accurate. If Major Chen had ignored the altitude discrepancy report, the mission would have proceeded as planned. If the town had been surrounded by military installations rather than farmland, missing the primary target would have caused collateral damage rather than harmless explosions in empty fields. The conjunction of mechanical failure, human judgment, and geographical luck that saved Rothenburg was unlikely enough to seem miraculous to the people who witnessed it. Greta Müller, watching bombs fall away from her town, experienced the kind of divine intervention that people pray for but rarely see. Anna, kneading bread while explosives fell on distant fields, witnessed the kind of mercy that seems to validate faith in protective forces beyond human understanding. Do you think the residents of Rothenburg understood how close they had come to annihilation? Do you think they realized that their town's survival depended on an American bombardier's decision to trust his eyes more than his instruments? The immediate aftermath of the failed bombing raid created confusion for both American and German forces. Allied intelligence had expected the railway junction at Rothenburg to be severely damaged, disrupting German supply lines and forcing traffic to alternative routes that were more vulnerable to interdiction. When reconnaissance photos showed the town intact and the railway functioning normally, analysts suspected that the bombing raid had been less effective than pilot reports indicated. German forces were equally confused by the bombing pattern. Intelligence officers examining the crater patterns in Weber's fields couldn't determine what military target the Americans had been trying to hit. The bomb distribution suggested either extremely poor navigation or deliberately random area bombing, neither of which matched typical Allied tactical patterns. The confusion persisted for weeks, with both sides developing theories about what had gone wrong with a bombing mission that should have been routine. American planners suspected equipment malfunctions or navigation errors. German analysts theorized about new Allied tactics designed to confuse rather than destroy specific targets. None of the official analyses identified the true cause of the targeting error: a faulty altimeter that had caused altitude miscalculation, which had led to bombing inaccuracy, which had resulted in the preservation of a medieval town that represented irreplaceable European cultural heritage. The preservation of Rothenburg had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. The town's survival intact meant that post-war Germany retained an example of medieval urban architecture that existed nowhere else in Central Europe. Tourism that had been interrupted by the war resumed in the 1950s, bringing visitors from around the world to see a town that looked exactly as it had before the Industrial Revolution. The economic impact of Rothenburg's preservation eventually exceeded the military value of its railway junction. Tourism revenue generated by visitors who came to see authentic medieval architecture provided employment and prosperity for the region long after the strategic importance of the railway had diminished with the development of highway transportation. Greta Müller grew up to become a tour guide, leading visitors through the streets that had been saved by an American bombardier's faulty altimeter. She specialized in the history of the town's survival during World War II, telling the story of November 8, 1944, when American bombs fell on empty fields instead of ancient buildings. Greta's tours always ended at the spot where she had stood as a child, watching bombs fall away from her town toward distant fields. She would point toward the area where Weber's farm had absorbed the explosives meant for Rothenburg, and she would tell visitors about the American airmen whose decision to question his instruments had saved their destination. "We are standing here," Greta would say, "because someone chose accuracy over efficiency, because someone trusted human judgment more than mechanical instruments, because someone made a mistake that was more right than being right would have been. Anna lived until 1991, long enough to see Rothenburg become a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized for its outstanding universal value as an example of medieval European urban architecture. She died knowing that the town she had watched bombs miss had become one of Germany's most important cultural destinations, visited by millions of people who came to see what had been preserved by chance, choice, and error. Lieutenant Walsh returned to civilian life after the war and became a precision instrument technician, working for companies that manufactured the altimeters, navigation equipment, and bombing systems that he had used in combat. His post-war career was dedicated to preventing the kind of instrument failures that had characterized his most memorable combat mission. Walsh never knew about Rothenburg's cultural significance until 1978, when a letter from Greta Müller reached him through veteran organizations that had helped her track down members of the bomber crew that had missed her town. Greta's letter included photographs of Rothenburg as it appeared in the 1970s. Medieval walls intact, half-timbered houses preserved, cobblestone streets unchanged since her childhood. "Your faulty altimeter," Greta wrote, "saved something that can never be replaced. You were trying to destroy a railway junction, but you preserved a piece of history that belongs to all humanity. I hope you understand that missing your target was the most accurate thing you could have done." Walsh kept Greta's letter and photographs for the rest of his life, but he never displayed them prominently or used them to tell stories about his war service. The letter represented something too complex for simple pride, a military failure that had become a cultural success, a targeting error that had preserved irreplaceable heritage, a moment when being wrong had been more valuable than being right. The broader implications of Rothenburg's preservation extended into post-war debates about the relationship between military necessity and cultural heritage during armed conflict. The town's survival became a case study in how chance and individual judgment could protect cultural sites when official policies provided inadequate protection. The 1949 Geneva Conventions included provisions for protecting cultural heritage during armed conflict, partly inspired by the recognition that sites like Rothenburg had survived World War II through luck rather than law. The protocols established obligations for military forces to avoid targeting cultural sites unless they were being used for military purposes, and to minimize damage to cultural heritage even when military targets were legitimate. Walsh's altimeter error had contributed to the development of international humanitarian law that balanced military necessity against cultural preservation. The mistake that had saved one medieval town had helped establish principles that would protect cultural heritage in future conflicts. The altimeter that had malfunctioned over Rothenburg was eventually displayed in the National Museum of World War II Aviation in New Orleans, identified as an example of how equipment failures could have unintended positive consequences. The instrument that had failed to measure altitude accurately had succeeded in preserving something more valuable than any military target. Museum visitors who examined the faulty altimeter rarely understood its full significance. They saw a piece of obsolete military equipment, an example of the kind of mechanical systems that had been used in World War II bombing aircraft. Few realized that they were looking at an instrument whose failure had saved one of Europe's most important examples of medieval architecture. The museum label that accompanied the altimeter display read simply, "Altimeter from B-17G Memphis Belle du Secours, November 1944." Altitude reading error contributed to targeting inaccuracy during mission over southern Germany. See, the label didn't mention Rothenburg, didn't describe the cultural heritage that had been preserved, didn't explain that mechanical failure had sometimes accomplished what human wisdom had not. The story of the altimeter that saved Rothenburg became part of the larger narrative about the role of chance, error, and individual choice in determining historical outcomes. Wars are decided not just by strategy, leadership, and resources, but also by the accumulation of small events that deflect the course of larger forces in directions that no one could predict or control. Walsh's decision to trust his eyes rather than his instruments represented the kind of individual judgment that could override technological systems when human perception detected errors that machines could not recognize. The bombardier who questioned his altimeter reading had exercised the kind of professional skepticism that prevented technological failures from becoming human disasters. But the preservation of Rothenburg also demonstrated the limits of human control over historical events. The conjunction of mechanical failure, individual judgment, and geographical circumstance that had saved the town was unlikely enough to seem miraculous, too complex to be replicated deliberately, too dependent on chance to be considered a reliable method for protecting cultural heritage. The medieval walls that had protected Rothenburg from siege warfare for centuries had been unable to protect the town from modern aerial bombardment. But a faulty American altimeter had accomplished what stone fortifications could not, deflecting 20th-century explosives away from medieval buildings through a chain of cause and effect that connected mechanical failure to cultural preservation. In the end, Rothenburg's survival became a reminder that the most important preservation sometimes happens accidentally, and that the instruments we trust to guide us can serve us better by failing at the right moment than by working perfectly at the wrong time. The altimeter that couldn't measure altitude correctly had measured something more important: the value of heritage that transcends military necessity, and the importance of human judgment that can recognize when being wrong is more right than being right. If stories like this make you think about the hidden connections between mechanical failures and cultural preservation, about the way individual decisions can override technological systems, about the altimeters we all carry, and the readings we sometimes choose to question, then perhaps you understand why some instruments are worth preserving even when they don't work, why some errors are worth remembering even when they compromise efficiency, and why the most important measurements sometimes happen when we trust our humanity more than our technology.